I can see a circumstance where there is a deal, not the one that's on the table right now, because I don't think the Iranians have any interest in negotiating that, and I don't think they feel enough pressure.
Today is Thursday, March 26th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. We're now far enough into the war with Iran to consider whether this campaign is moving toward a meaningful strategic outcome or settling into a prolonged and costly stalemate. After all, the Iranian regime is still in power, it continues to carry out strikes across the region, and it retains its ability to disrupt one of the world's most critical waterways, the Strait of Hormuz. Even in a best-case scenario, Iran isn't going away. The infrastructure that's been destroyed can be rebuilt, and its allies can help it rearm. So what realistically can be achieved from here, and what would success even look like? To help us think through these questions, I'm joined today by Dennis Ross, one of the most experienced American diplomats and Middle East negotiators. He's currently a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and has played a central role in shaping U.S. policy in the Middle East. He served as the lead negotiator in the peace process under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and later as a senior advisor on Iran in the Obama administration. Let's get into it. Dennis Ross, welcome to Boundless Insights.
Really nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so pleased to have you here. We have a lot to talk about. We are now several weeks into the war, and if you listen to the critics, they would say it's an unprovoked, unnecessary attack on Iran, that Israel wanted this and the U.S. doesn't need it. They would say the war is putting the global economy at risk and that there is no clear objective or endgame. So I want to start by asking you, how do you feel the war is going?
Built into your question are all sorts of criticisms, some of which I think are legitimate, some of which are not. So what I'd like to do before I answer how the war is going is to put it in the context of saying, first, the notion that this was unprovoked must come from people who live on a different planet. Iran learned nothing from the June War. It went back to doing everything that it had done. It was once again trying to get money and arms, even though it had its own limitation on resources within Iran that clearly helped to provoke all 31 provinces in protest and upheaval. Still, they were pouring their resources back into the same old strategy that, by the way, a segment of the elite had criticized after the June War, who said basically the regional proxy approach cost us enormous amounts of money and brought us nothing. By my count, by the way, $500 billion investment in nuclear infrastructure, and basically that's all gone. This was not a smart strategy. This was a failing strategy for Iran. Those voices you could hear for the first couple of weeks after the June War, and then basically the Supreme Leader Khamenei drowned them out. So the notion that this is unprovoked, given who Iran was, what they were continuing to do, again, it's a benign view of Iran. It explains away Iran's behavior. This is a country, after all, Khamenei put in downtown Tehran a 25-year clock ticking down for when Israel would disappear. So the notion it's unprovoked, I think, again, it comes from those who are prepared always to explain away Iran's behavior, as it turns out, including the fact that they may have killed in 2 days as many as 30,000 of their own people. Somehow, this is meaningless. Now, having said it's a war whose objectives are not clear, that's fair. It's a mistake of the president not to come to the American people and explain, we have tried to make diplomacy work. We've sought to negotiate with the Iranians. They're not prepared to give up their nuclear weapons program. They're not prepared to stop threatening the rest of the region. They are building it as fast as they can, a ballistic missile capability, even as they oppress their people. At the end of the day, we may not be about nation building, but we cannot tolerate an Iran that threatens the rest of the region. And we have sought diplomacy as an answer. That hasn't been it. Here's what our objective is. We're not about regime change. In the end, that will be up to the Iranian people. But we are about Iran not being able to threaten the region, their neighborhood, and the rest of the world. So that means they will not have a nuclear weapons program. A ballistic missile program will have to be shrunk in terms of size, in terms of range of missiles. They will stop supporting regional proxies who are designed to create nothing but upheaval, coercion, and intimidation in the region. Had he said what I just said and repeated it over and over again, first, I think there'd be more support for this among the American public. There'd be more support, even internationally, and the context of fighting this war would be different. One other point. It is incomprehensible that you would go to war not knowing that Strait of Hormuz could be threatened by the Iranians at some point. I have no doubt that Central Command did have that as part of the war plan, but it was probably not ranking high in terms of the other priorities, where first you had to basically ensure there wasn't air defense. Second, you had to protect your own forces and your friends, contribute to that. And you had to dramatically degrade the Iranian ability to threaten everybody else, which was the reason you were doing this to begin with. The amount of force you needed for that didn't put the Strait of Hormuz as one of the priorities where forces would be focused. But that should have led the administration before the war. The president said we didn't want to give away surprise. That's not the issue. The issue is your Secretary of State goes to the allies in Europe and says to them, look, we are trying to resolve this with the Iranians through diplomacy. It may not work. If it doesn't work, clearly we are going to act to reduce the threat that Iran can be opposing to the region, not just now, but for a long time to come. But we obviously have to plan against the contingency that they will try to control all the movement in and out of the Gulf through the Straits. So let's develop right now a contingency plan, who will do what, and what forces we can apply to keep the Straits open.
And you're confident that didn't happen? Because I, like you, think that it had to be a part of the calculation before they went to war, that holding the global economy hostage, holding oil hostage, was going to be the primary lever that Iran would use. And more than that, your chief criticism is that the administration or the president hasn't been clear in explaining the objectives and goals. I think we all know that this president is known for saying lots of different things that are often contradictory. You yourself have written that unclear objectives give policymakers flexibility, and it also creates confusion. And I wonder if perhaps, in addition to not being known for clear, direct, and transparent communication, part of this is the president's strategy, because whatever he's saying to the American public, obviously the Iranians are listening, and they are master negotiators, and part of the confusion may be how he conducts this war very intentionally.
Aviva, first of all, I think what you're saying describes President Trump. But I have a book out called Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. And what's the essence of that book? Good statecraft is marrying objectives and means. And that requires you to be very clear in your objectives so you can apply the right kinds of means, your own or mobilized means from others that adds to your ability to fulfill your objectives.
Certainly, but we don't know if the objectives internally that aren't being communicated are far clearer than what we're hearing in the public realm.
Okay, but then you just validated my point, because if that was the case, how come nothing was done to protect the Strait of Hormuz?
You're saying Iran should never have been allowed to get to the point where it could even create the chokehold.
Absolutely. This is their main point of leverage. And we're contributing to it because we have taken what has been, their approach has always been, if we can't export our oil, nobody can. Now we have this paradoxical situation where they're the only ones who are able to export the oil. And that gives them enormous strategic leverage. The president, because I understand why he wants to keep oil prices as low as possible, and therefore you lift sanctions that were applied to the Russians, you allow the Iranians to export their oil. The Secretary of Treasury says we want to let that oil get out there for the overall market, but that's a tactical move. And what you're giving the Iranians is strategic leverage. The president now wants to negotiate based on a 15-point plan. Do the Iranians have a stake in that? Not so long as they think that time is on their side, because they're controlling what can come in and out of the Gulf.
Yeah, their list of demands was quite outrageous. So I totally agree with you that Iran seems to have built its entire war strategy around this ability to disrupt global energy. And we know the Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil. And the demands that they have laid out, I'll just recite them for folks listening, is number one, the closure of all U.S. bases in the Gulf, reparations for strikes on Iran, a Hormuz transit fee arrangement, meaning they want payment for ships to pass, an end to strikes on Hezbollah and Lebanon, the lifting of all sanctions on Iran, and the preservation of its missile program, which just seems to me totally delusional.
Well, it better be. I mean, if the outcome of the war allows for any of that, then they won. It will have defeated the purpose of this war. That won't be the outcome of the war. And in the end, they won't get that. But it also puts President Trump in a position where for him to achieve his objectives, he's going to have to find a way to ensure that the Straits of Hormuz are open. and that the Iranians don't maintain this as a stranglehold. One point I want to make in addition to this, just to put it in historical perspective. The national security of the United States was driven by a basic premise as it related to the movement and flow of petrochemicals out of the Middle East. For years and years, when the Soviet Union was there, the objective was make sure the Soviets can't gain leverage or control over the flow of oil and energy sources out of the Gulf. When the Bush 41 administration, when President Bush made the decision that we would undo Saddam Hussein's aggression in Iraq, one small part of it, maybe not such a small part of it, was now that the Soviets basically no longer exist as a threat, we can't allow a regional actor that's hostile to gain control over that. And now what we have today is something we haven't seen before. Iran now has control over that. That cannot be the outcome of this war.
So I want to talk to you. I did start by asking, how do you feel the war is going? So we know you're not happy about how it's going with the Strait of Hormuz, but when we step back more broadly, what is your assessment?
I see some good news here. And I see some good news now and even potentially in the future. The good news is there is no question in my mind that the Iranians, in terms of their ability to threaten their neighbors with ballistic missiles, with cruise missiles, and with drones, that threat, though it obviously still exists because they're firing on a daily basis, that threat has been dramatically reduced from what it could have been. And it's not just what they're able to fire now, it's what is being attacked in terms of what I call the production chain. Let's just take ballistic missiles as an example. You have multiple component parts that go into a ballistic missile, where we're talking about the propulsion system, the engine, the guidance, how you fit the warheads. Every one of those, there's a different place for fabrication. It's all part of an industrial infrastructure. What the U.S. and Israel, what I would say even Israel maybe more than the U.S., but what the U.S. and Israel together are doing is destroying the ability to make the ballistic missiles, to make the drones, to make the cruise missiles. That has greater significance because that allows you to create a fairly long period of time for them to reconstitute. And by the way, if they tried to reconstitute quickly, they would have to pour all their resources into that, which would leave nothing to deal with domestic needs. This leads to my second point. This is a government, this is a regime. They could not address the grievances of their public prior to this war. Their capability of addressing those grievances afterwards is even less. We know from what happened starting on December 28th that every class, every segment of the Iranian society was basically up in arms, maybe not literally, but was protesting, demonstrating, and showing a loss of fear of the regime. Now, this regime, because its attitude is it'll kill whatever it has to do to try to survive, we know that in 2 days they may have killed more than 30,000 people, which, if you think about it, is almost incomprehensible. They were simply massacring their own people. And again, you could say, well, maybe they'll continue to do that. But I want you to think about something. For a regime that cannot provide the most fundamental element of governance, water. Last summer, you had 3 weeks in a row with temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Tehran, and you had no water availability for 6 to 8 hours a day. The same with electricity. You have a currency that has no value. Now, the elite, they get the water, they get the electricity, they have the private generators, they can get whatever goods they want. But the rank and file, the people who pull those triggers, they don't have that. Now, how long is it before they begin to question, why are they doing this? So my point is, this is a regime, we're not going to see it collapse during the war. Okay, anybody who thought that didn't understand the dynamics of what happens, what produces regime collapse. But in this case, I would say, if a year from now you and I are talking, I think there's a decent chance we won't have this regime. Now, maybe we'll have Iranian Gorbachevs who emerge. Jim Baker and I were dealing with Shevardnadze and his assistant Tarasenko. Baker asked Shevardnadze at one point the question, why are you and Gorbachev so committed to reform? And he said, because we can produce an ICBM and we can't produce a hypodermic needle. There are those, again, I hearken back to after the June War, those who are saying this strategy of regional proxies and building up the nuclear infrastructure, it's a colossal failure. There will be those who say the only way we can survive is to transform what we are and what we will be. Now that, by the way, would be maybe less upheaval if it's an Iranian Gorbachev. there are other alternatives for sure. You could have something emerge from the public. That's much harder to predict. Those who think that they know who the opposition are, who would emerge, they're kidding themselves or they're kidding us, because nobody knows. The Iranians have been very good at killing or arresting anybody who could be a potential leader. The fact that on the outside you have multiple factions and they can't cohere suggests this is not such a simple proposition. But my point is, a regime that can't address any of the fundamental grievances or deliver fundamental governance, and it's less capable now, is not likely to last for a long time. So I also see that as good news.
There was a wealth of amazing information there to unpack. So let's start with, you talked about the ballistic missiles and the capabilities and the infrastructure that existed for Iran to build them up and the stockpiles that they had. That's actually one of the reasons that I believe the war started when it did. We hear that it was about on the brink of nuclear capability, but to be honest, I've been hearing that for about 10 years. What does seem to be the case is there reaches a point where Iran has more ballistic missiles than there are interceptors to defend American bases and, of course, allies in the region. And so that seemed to me sort of the tipping point where we have to intervene now, where we're really not going to be able to defend when we want to go after the nuclear weapons program. I also really think it's an important point about what you said, that, Iran's economy was in shambles, its water and electrical infrastructure on the brink of collapse, and yet its killing machine, its repression machine, very much intact, very efficient, as you said, the ability to take out 30,000 Iranians in 2 days. I think the fear that so many people has is, okay, the infrastructure has been badly degraded, but that is something that can be rebuilt. Maybe it'll take a few years, but Iran is allied with countries like China, Russia, North Korea. Nuclear sites were hit, but they still have their enriched uranium. And certainly that determination to pursue a nuclear weapon hasn't changed. We can see from their list of demands that this regime is delusional. So if the war ended tomorrow, because the other component is, we know President Trump does not have the stomach for a war like Russia and Ukraine are having. This is a war that's not going to last to the midterms. I think we can all accept that. So if the war were to end tomorrow, Iran would be weakened, but not neutralized. So if it can rebuild and adapt and continue to impose costs on the global community, then is this simply a stalemate? What was the purpose?
Well, part of it is it can't end, first of all, with them in control of the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a stalemate. They have put themselves in a position where they have a chokehold over the world's economy. That's not a stalemate. That's a loss. So that can't be the outcome. If the war were to end tomorrow, yes, they could rebuild. They're still going to face all these domestic constraints. There still will be some kind of a competition within the elite. Even if in the near term it's the Revolutionary Guard that is running this, they're still going to have to make some choices. And you put your finger on something that is critical. There are 440 kilograms of highly enriched to 60% uranium. Even if the rest of the nuclear infrastructure has been destroyed, meaning what they would need to be able to convert that, they don't need a lot of centrifuges to be able to turn 60% into, that's 12 bombs worth of material. So you don't need a lot of centrifuges. Maybe they don't have them now, but those can be, in a warehouse, maybe you have 200 operating, not a large number. That 60% is the hardest thing. They may not have blast chambers, they may not have neutron initiators. So it's not the ability, you can't turn that immediately into a nuclear weapon, but it means you have the hardest thing it takes to be able to put together a nuclear weapon is the highly enriched weapons-grade material. So if it ends tomorrow, the one thing that the president should say is, if we see any move to reconstitute that, we will bomb that site. And before he should do that, he should go to the Democrats and say, look, we agree on very little. You didn't like this war, but you can agree Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. And I want to, before I make this commitment, I want it clear this is a bipartisan commitment. I want to know the Democrats will stand up and say, sorry, we're not prepared to bomb 60%, which they shouldn't have in the first place. Recall, Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, said there is no justifiable civilian purpose for enrichment to 60%. No justifiable civilian purpose. So that, I think, is an answer. Just on this question, let's say there's a deal. I mean, I can see a circumstance where there is a deal, not the one that's on the table right now, because I don't think the Iranians have any interest in negotiating that, and I don't think they feel enough pressure. unless they're in a worse situation than you and I think they are right now. And it's possible. It's possible. And it's possible they could be concerned about the threats the president is making more about putting boots on the ground where they could actually lose specific assets. That's possible. I'm not sure they feel it yet, but it could be wishful thinking, but it's possible. But the key here is if you end up having a deal, the one thing that deal has to produce is an agreement on the extraction of that 440 kilograms that has to be out of Iran.
So really two conditions: no ability to control the Strait of Hormuz, no enriched uranium to 60%.
Yes. If that's the case, I'm comfortable with the
call that a win.
Because of the way they've been, yes, because the way they have been set back. And as I said, first of all, just the enormity of what they will have to do to try to reconstitute. I mean, I think it's easy to say they can reconstitute. I think it totally underestimates what they're going to be facing with not a lot of resources, although clearly any deal will probably involve some lifting of the sanctions. But the reality is that's not going to be enough for them to deal with the enormity of what they have to do, and a public whose restiveness is going to come back.
That is true. But as we know, the Iranians are far more patient than Americans are. And I think somewhere in their calculation, they're looking at the current political climate in America and saying the proposal that you suggested, that President Trump would go to the Democrats and say, we can at least all agree that no nuclear Iran, that it's hard for me to actually envision the Democrats saying, you know what, on this one point, we will agree, because we are so polarized. We're so deeply entrenched in this country that I think they wonder, listen, we just have to wait out this president, and then we probably have a green light for whatever we want.
By the way, I am worried that is the Iranian view. I am worried about that.
Probably it would be the smart one.
Yeah.
We have to wrap soon, but I want to ask you one last question. According to the New York Times, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman urged President Trump to continue the war against Iran. He said, like you said, only regime change can ultimately eliminate this long-term threat, and this could be a historic moment to reshape the Middle East. My question is, it's one thing to talk, it's another thing to do. Why have we not seen the Gulf states enter this war? After all, they are being attacked every single day.
Yeah. I think the main reason we haven't seen it is because they're worried about what more the Iranians would be able to do to them. I think they're very worried about the desalination plants being hit. If that gets hit, they are in really desperate straits. They're worried about more of the energy infrastructure, their energy infrastructure being hit in a way that will take a long time to rebuild. And the whole focal point, especially of the Saudis, the Emirates, and others, has been specifically, we are transforming who we are. We're building diversified economies. We're going to be regional hubs for AI, and it's all based on this kind of economic modernization. So I think that's the main reason. But I would also say, we don't know for sure if that story is completely true, but it's plausible. And it's plausible because you can see they didn't want this in the first place because they preferred calm. But they also, the last thing in the world they want is Iran to be in a position where it has leverage over them. And they fear if the war ends now, Iran is in a position where they have leverage over them. You know, they control the Straits of Hormuz, and basically they say, you don't get to export unless we let you export. And here's what else you're going to have to pay us for. So for them, that's an untenable, unthinkable kind of outcome. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he may have said, you can't stop now. You have to end this in a way where Iran is not only so weakened that they cannot be a threat, and they certainly can't be in a position where they have any leverage. And I think, again, unfortunately, the only way is to deal with the Strait of Hormuz, if it isn't a deal that can be enforced, is for us to open it up. Now, for us to open it up, first you have to have convoys, and convoys are a messy answer because the president can talk about how we've destroyed their Navy. They have 1,000 small boats. Small boats can go and drop mines. Small boats carry RPGs. And, maybe an RPG is not so simple to take out a tanker, but if you hit the right spot of the tanker, the shippers then say, well, I'm not risking my ship.
Right. There's also the drones, right? You can't get insurance to pass through with that type of risk.
So it's not a simple thing, but there are different options available. One is you have a military option. Two is you could take Khark Island. 3 is you could just decide now, we're blockading. You don't get to export your oil anymore. Okay, you want to try to control the straits? Guess what? You no longer are able to export your oil. I think it's been a strategic mistake to allow them to export their oil. A tactical move, I understand, but a strategic mistake.
You brought so much information and so much clarity to this conversation. Dennis, I want to thank you, and I hope you'll come back soon.
Aviva, you raise such good points that I'll come back anytime you want.
Thank you. That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.